The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of the royal palace as General Marcus Wellington adjusted his gold-braided uniform one final time. Today marked the most important inspection of his 30-year military career. The defense minister himself had chosen Wellington to evaluate the palace security forces, and failure was not an option. Wellington had earned his reputation through decisive action and unwavering discipline. His men respected him, his superiors trusted him, and his enemies feared him. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through proper military protocol. The palace gates stood 20 feet high, adorned with intricate ironwork that had protected royalty for over 2 centuries. As Wellington approached, his polished boots clicked rhythmically against the cobblestones. He expected to see the finest soldiers in the kingdom standing at attention, their uniforms immaculate, their posture perfect. Instead, he encountered something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Standing beside the ornate gate was a palace guard unlike any he had ever seen. The man appeared to be in his early 20s, with sandy brown hair that stuck out slightly from beneath his ceremonial hat. His uniform, while clean, showed signs of wear that suggested countless hours of faithful service. But what truly caught Wellington's attention was the guard's face. The young man's eyes held a distant look, unfocused and somehow empty. He stared straight ahead, but his gaze seemed to pass through everything around him, as if he were seeing a different world entirely. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly as they gripped his ceremonial rifle, and when Wellington drew closer, he noticed the guard's lips moving silently, forming words that no one else could hear. Wellington's first instinct was anger. How dare the palace employ someone so obviously unfit for duty? This guard was clearly distracted, possibly even mentally unstable. The general's jaw tightened as he prepared to deliver the sharp reprimand that had become his trademark. "Guard!" Wellington's voice boomed across the courtyard with the authority of 3 decades in command. "Stand at attention!" The young man's body snapped to the proper position, but his eyes remained unfocused. Wellington stepped closer, his heavy boots echoing ominously against the stone. Other guards nearby tensed, sensing the storm that was about to break. "State your name and rank, soldier," Wellington commanded, his voice dripping with disapproval. "Private James Mitchell, sir," the guard replied, his voice barely above a whisper. There was something fragile about the way he spoke, like glass on the verge of shattering. Wellington circled the young guard like a predator stalking prey. He had seen thousands of soldiers in his career, and he prided himself on being able to read a man's character in minutes. But Private Mitchell puzzled him. Despite his obvious distraction, the guard's uniform was properly maintained, his weapon was clean, and his posture, though he seemed unsteady, was technically correct. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you, Private," Wellington barked. Mitchell's eyes shifted toward the general, but they never quite met his gaze. Instead, they seemed to focus on something just over Wellington's shoulder, something that wasn't there. "Sir, Mitchell began, then stopped, his voice trailing off into silence. Wellington's patience, already thin, began to evaporate completely. In his experience, soldiers who couldn't follow simple orders were soldiers who got people killed. He had no tolerance for weakness, especially not in the men charged with protecting the royal family. "You what, Private?" Wellington's voice grew colder. "Can't you complete a simple sentence?" The other guards watched nervously as their general prepared to unleash his famous temper. They had all heard stories about Wellington's legendary discipline sessions, and none of them envied Private Mitchell's position. But as Wellington raised his voice to deliver what promised to be a devastating reprimand, something unexpected happened. Mitchell's trembling hands slowly reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a worn piece of paper. His movements were careful, deliberate, as if the paper were made of the most delicate material imaginable. "Sir," Mitchell said, his voice stronger now, but still shaking. "I have a letter. From my mother. She died last week." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Wellington felt his prepared speech die in his throat. Around them, the other guards shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to maintain their positions or offer comfort to their fellow soldier. Mitchell's hands shook as he unfolded the letter, the paper rustling softly in the morning breeze. "She wrote this before she passed. The doctors gave it to me yesterday. She said she was proud of me for serving at the palace. She said she knew I would make her proud." Wellington found himself in unfamiliar territory. Throughout his career, he had dealt with insubordination, cowardice, and incompetence, with swift, decisive action. But grief? Raw, honest grief from a young man who was clearly trying his best to fulfill his duties while his world fell apart around him? The general's training told him to maintain discipline, to remind Mitchell that personal problems had no place in military service. But something deeper, something he had buried under decades of rigid protocol, whispered that perhaps this situation called for a different approach. Mitchell looked down at the letter, and for the first time since Wellington had approached him, his eyes seemed to truly focus. "She taught me about honor, sir, about doing your duty no matter what. I'm trying to do that. I'm really trying." The young guard's voice broke on the last word, and Wellington watched as a single tear escaped down Mitchell's cheek before he quickly wiped it away. The guard straightened his shoulders, clearly fighting to maintain his composure in front of his commanding officer. Wellington stood in silence, his mind racing. Every regulation, every manual, every lesson from his military academy training told him exactly what he should do in this situation. A distracted guard was a liability. Personal problems were exactly that, personal. Military discipline required that emotions be set aside in favor of duty. But as he looked at Mitchell, really looked at him, Wellington saw something that gave him pause. Despite his obvious pain, despite his trembling hands and unfocused gaze, the young man had reported for duty. He hadn't called in sick. He hadn't abandoned his post. He was here, trying to honor his responsibilities, even while his heart was breaking. The general found himself remembering his own mother's death, 20 years earlier. He had been commanding a regiment in a remote outpost when the news arrived. His commanding officer had granted him leave to attend the funeral, but Wellington had chosen to remain at his post, believing that duty came before personal grief. He had never questioned that decision, but looking at Mitchell now, he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of palace life continuing around them. Other guards maintained their positions, but watched nervously from the corners of their eyes. Palace staff went about their morning routines, unaware of the drama unfolding at the main gate. Wellington realized that his next words would define not only Mitchell's immediate future, but possibly his own character as a leader. The young guard stood at attention, waiting for judgment, his mother's letter still clutched in his trembling hands. The general had built his reputation on making quick, decisive choices, but this moment felt different somehow, weighted with implications he couldn't quite grasp. As he studied Mitchell's face, the exhaustion, the pain, but also the determined effort to fulfill his duties, Wellington felt something shift inside him. For the first time in his distinguished career, General Marcus Wellington found himself questioning whether the rigid application of military discipline was always the right answer. And that realization would change everything that happened next. Wellington took a step back, his mind wrestling with emotions he hadn't felt in decades. The military had trained him to see situations in black and white, but Private Mitchell existed in shades of gray that no manual had prepared him for. "Private Mitchell," Wellington said finally, his voice softer than anyone had heard it in years. "When did you last eat?" The question surprised everyone within earshot, including Mitchell himself. The young guard blinked, as if trying to process this unexpected turn in the conversation. I'm not sure, sir. Yesterday morning, perhaps. Wellington nodded slowly, pieces of a larger picture beginning to form in his mind. And when did you last sleep? Mitchell's silence was answer enough. The dark circles under his eyes, the slight sway in his stance, the way he seemed to be holding himself upright through sheer force of will, it all made sense now. "Guards!" Wellington called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Sergeant Reynolds, front and center!" A stocky man with graying temples stepped forward and snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." "Sergeant, I want you to escort Private Mitchell to the guard quarters. See that he gets a hot meal and a proper rest. He's not to return to duty until I give explicit orders." Reynolds looked confused but nodded. "Yes, sir. And if I may ask, sir, what should I tell the duty roster supervisor?" Wellington considered the question. By all rights, he should be recommending Mitchell for disciplinary action, possibly even discharge from service. A guard who couldn't maintain focus was a security risk that no protocol manual would tolerate. "Tell him that Private Mitchell is under my direct orders for special assignment," Wellington replied. "He's not to be disturbed or questioned about his status." As Reynolds led the bewildered Mitchell away, Wellington found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time that morning. The other guards had returned to their posts, but he could feel their eyes on him, wondering what had just happened to their famously rigid general. Wellington walked to a nearby bench in the palace garden, a space he had never used during his previous inspections. He always conducted his business standing, maintaining the proper military bearing that had defined his identity for so long. But today, something compelled him to sit, to think, to remember. His own mother, Eleanor Wellington, had been a gentlewoman who had never quite understood her son's drive for military perfection. She had attended his graduation from the academy, his promotion ceremonies, his award presentations, always smiling proudly but with a sadness in her eyes that he had never bothered to explore. When she died, Wellington had been in command of a strategic outpost during a tense border dispute. His commanding officer had offered him leave, but Wellington had declined, stating that his duty to his soldiers and his country took precedence over personal matters. He had attended the funeral by proxy, sending his aide to represent him while he maintained his post. At the time, he had been proud of his dedication. His fellow officers had praised his commitment. His superiors had noted his reliability in his permanent record. But sitting in the palace garden, watching Mitchell's retreating figure, Wellington wondered what he had really accomplished by missing his mother's funeral. Had his presence at the outpost actually made any difference? The border dispute had resolved itself through diplomatic channels weeks later. His aide could have managed the day-to-day operations perfectly well, but his mother was buried without her son present, and Wellington had never allowed himself to truly grieve her loss. The general sat in contemplation for nearly an hour, something that would have been unthinkable to him just days before. Palace staff moved around him, some recognizing his rank and offering respectful nods, others simply going about their duties unaware that one of the kingdom's most decorated officers was experiencing the most profound moment of self-reflection in his career. When Wellington finally stood, he had made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew him, including himself. He walked purposefully to the palace administrative offices, his boots echoing through marble corridors lined with portraits of kings and queens. The head steward, a meticulous man named Harrison, who had served the royal family for 40 years, looked up in surprise as the general entered his domain. "General Wellington, sir, how may I assist you?" "Mr. Harrison, I need information about one of your guards, Private James Mitchell. Specifically, I need to know about his service record, his family situation, and any personal circumstances that might affect his duties." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but he maintained his professional composure. "Of course, sir. May I ask the nature of your inquiry? Wellington had prepared several official-sounding explanations during his walk to the office, but when the moment came, he found himself speaking with unexpected honesty. The young man has recently lost his mother. I want to understand his situation so I can determine how best to support him while maintaining palace security standards. The word support seemed to surprise Harrison as much as it surprised Wellington himself. In 30 years of military service, the general had never used that word in reference to a subordinate's personal problems. Harrison nodded thoughtfully and withdrew a thick file from his cabinet. Private Mitchell has been with us for 18 months, sir. His record is exemplary. Never late, never absent without proper authorization, consistently high marks for uniform maintenance and protocol adherence. Wellington studied the file as Harrison continued. His mother, Sarah Mitchell, was a widow who worked as a seamstress in the town below the palace. According to our records, she was Private Mitchell's only living relative. She passed away last Tuesday after a brief illness. Has he requested leave for funeral arrangements? No, sir. In fact, he specifically requested to maintain his regular duty schedule. He said his mother would have wanted him to honor his commitments. Wellington closed the file slowly, his respect for the young guard growing. Mitchell could have easily justified taking time off, but instead, he had chosen to fulfill his responsibilities even while dealing with unimaginable loss. Mr. Harrison, I want to make an unusual request. I'm authorizing emergency compassionate leave for Private Mitchell, effective immediately. He's to have 2 weeks to handle his mother's affairs and to grieve properly. His position and pay are to be maintained during this period. Harrison made careful notes, though his expression suggested he had never received such a request from a visiting inspector. Very good, sir. Shall I process this through normal military channels? No, Wellington replied firmly. This authorization comes directly from me as part of my inspection report. Any questions about the leave should be directed to my office. As Wellington prepared to leave, Harrison cleared his throat politely. If I may observe, sir, this is quite generous. Private Mitchell will be very grateful. Wellington paused at the door, considering the steward's words. Mr. Harrison, in my experience, gratitude isn't the point. Taking care of your people is simply the right thing to do. The words surprised Wellington even as he spoke them. When had his perspective shifted so dramatically? When had he begun to think of soldiers as people first and military assets second? He left the administrative office with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. His next stop was the guard quarters, where he found Private Mitchell sitting alone at a wooden table, staring at his untouched meal. The young man jumped to attention when he saw the general approach. Sit down, Private, Wellington said gently. We need to talk. Mitchell remained standing, confusion written across his features. Sir, have I done something wrong? I know I wasn't focused this morning, but I can do better. I promise I can do better. Wellington gestured to the chair across from Mitchell. Son, you haven't done anything wrong. In fact, you've shown more dedication to duty under impossible circumstances than many soldiers show under normal conditions. The young guard slowly sat down, his eyes never leaving Wellington's face. The general could see the exhaustion, the grief, and beneath it all, the desperate hope that he hadn't failed in his responsibilities. Private Mitchell, I'm ordering you to take compassionate leave. 2 weeks, starting immediately. Your pay continues, your position is secure, and when you return, you'll resume your duties with no mark against your record. Mitchell's eyes widened in shock. Sir, I don't understand. I didn't request leave. I can continue my duties. My mother always said that work was the best medicine for a troubled heart. Wellington smiled sadly. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman, but even wise women can be wrong sometimes. You need time to grieve properly, to take care of her affairs, to say goodbye in the way she deserved. For a moment, Mitchell's composure cracked completely. Tears flowed freely down his cheeks as the weight of his loss finally found expression. Wellington sat quietly, his presence steady and supportive, allowing the young man to feel his pain without judgment. "She was so proud when I got this position, sir," Mitchell whispered. "She said I looked handsome in the uniform. She said serving the royal family was the highest honor a person could have." "She was right," Wellington replied. "And she would be proud of how you've conducted yourself, even in your darkest hour." As Mitchell gradually composed himself, Wellington felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in decades, he had acted not as a general following protocol, but as a human being responding to another's need. And surprisingly, it felt more like leadership than anything he had ever done. 2 weeks later, General Wellington found himself walking the same path through the palace courtyard. But everything felt different. His morning inspection routine had become less about finding flaws and more about understanding the people who served under his command. The change hadn't gone unnoticed by his staff or superiors, though no one quite knew how to address it. As he approached the main gate, Wellington saw a familiar figure standing at attention. Private Mitchell had returned from leave, and the transformation was remarkable. The young guard's uniform was impeccable, his posture confident, and most importantly, his eyes were clear and focused. When he spotted the general approaching, Mitchell's face broke into a genuine smile. "General Wellington, sir," Mitchell called out, snapping into a perfect salute. "Permission to speak, sir?" "Granted, Private. How are you feeling?" Mitchell's smile grew wider. "Much better, sir." "Thank you for forcing me to take that time. You were right. I needed to properly say goodbye to my mother and take care of her affairs. I couldn't have done my job properly while carrying that burden." Wellington nodded, studying the young man's face. The grief was still there, but it had transformed into something more manageable, more human. Mitchell looked like a soldier again, but more than that, he looked like a person who had processed his loss and found a way to move forward. "I'm glad to hear it, Private. Has everything been taken care of?" "Yes, sir. I was able to arrange a proper funeral service. Many people from our village came to pay their respects. My mother was well loved." Mitchell paused, his expression growing serious. "Sir, I also used the time to think about what she would want for my future. She always believed in education, in bettering oneself. I've decided to apply for officer training if the military will have me." Wellington raised an eyebrow, impressed by the young man's ambition. "That's a significant commitment, Private. Officer training is demanding, and there's no guarantee of acceptance." "I understand, sir, but my mother always said that the only way to honor someone's memory is to become the best version of yourself that you can be. I think she would want me to try." The general felt a familiar pride, but this time it was different from the satisfaction he usually derived from military excellence. This was pride in watching someone grow beyond their circumstances, in seeing potential realized through support rather than punishment. "I think your mother would be very proud of that decision, Private. When you're ready to submit your application, have it sent to my office. I'll ensure it receives proper consideration." Mitchell's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." As Wellington continued his inspection, he reflected on how much his approach to leadership had changed in just 2 weeks. He still maintained high standards and demanded excellence from his soldiers, but he had learned to see beyond the surface, to understand that sometimes the greatest strength came from acknowledging weakness and providing support when it was needed most. His transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by the other guards either. Word had spread quickly through the ranks about how the general had helped Mitchell during his time of need. The effect had been remarkable. Morale had improved dramatically, and soldiers who had previously been afraid to approach Wellington with problems now felt comfortable seeking guidance when they needed it. Sergeant Reynolds approached the general as he completed his rounds. "Sir, if I may say so, the men have noticed a change in the atmosphere around here. They appreciate your more personal approach to leadership." Wellington considered the sergeant's words carefully. "Sergeant, I've learned something important recently. We can't separate the human being from the soldier. When we take care of our people's hearts and minds, they serve better, fight better, and live better. That makes everyone more effective." "Yes, sir. The men respect you for it. They always respected your skill and discipline, but now they respect you as a person too." That afternoon, Wellington received an unexpected summons to the defense minister's office. As he walked through the imposing government building, he wondered if his recent changes in leadership style had been viewed negatively by his superiors. Perhaps his compassion toward Mitchell had been seen as weakness, or his decision to authorize leave had been viewed as overstepping his authority. Defense Minister Harrison, a different Harrison than the palace steward, was a stern man in his 60s who had known Wellington since his early career. When Wellington entered the office, the minister gestured for him to sit, his expression unreadable. "Marcus, I've been receiving some interesting reports about your recent inspection at the palace." Wellington straightened, preparing to defend his actions. "Sir, if there are concerns about my methods—" The minister held up a hand to stop him. "Actually, the reports have been quite positive. The palace staff has noted a significant improvement in guard morale and performance since your visit. They've specifically requested that you return as a regular inspector rather than a one-time evaluation." Wellington felt a surge of relief and pride. "I'm honored by their confidence, sir." "More than that, Marcus. I've been thinking about some of the challenges we face in military leadership across all our services. Too many good soldiers are lost, not because they lack skill or dedication, but because they lack the support they need during difficult times. Your approach with that young guard, Mitchell, wasn't it, suggests a different way of thinking about leadership." The minister leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "I'm creating a new position, Marcus, Director of Military Personnel Development. Your job would be to travel to our various installations and help commanding officers develop more effective approaches to soldier welfare and leadership. Are you interested?" Wellington was stunned. This was far from the disciplinary action he had feared. Instead, his moment of compassion with Mitchell had opened a door to a completely new career path, one that aligned perfectly with his evolving understanding of leadership. "Sir, I would be very honored to accept such a position. But I have one request." "What's that?" "I'd like to follow up on Private Mitchell's development. He's applying for officer training, and I believe he has significant potential. If he's accepted, I'd like to mentor him personally." The minister smiled. "I think that can be arranged. In fact, having a success story like Mitchell as part of your program would be quite valuable." 6 months later, Wellington stood in the same palace courtyard where his journey of transformation had begun. But this time, he wasn't there as an inspector. He was there to attend a ceremony honoring outstanding service members, and Private James Mitchell was among the recipients. Mitchell had not only been accepted into officer training, but had graduated at the top of his class. He was being promoted to second lieutenant and assigned to a prestigious position in the Palace Guard command structure. As the young man stepped forward to receive his promotion, Wellington felt a pride that surpassed any he had felt for his own achievements. The ceremony concluded with Mitchell delivering a brief speech about dedication and service. He spoke eloquently about the importance of supporting fellow soldiers during difficult times and about how true strength came from acknowledging both success and struggle as part of the human experience. "My mother taught me that honor isn't about never falling down," Mitchell said, his voice clear and confident. "Honor is about getting back up and helping others do the same. I've been blessed to serve under officers who understood this principle and who taught me that leadership means caring for your people as human beings first and soldiers second. As the applause died down, Mitchell caught Wellington's eye and offered a subtle nod of gratitude. The general nodded back, thinking about the unexpected journey that had brought them both to this moment. Later that evening, Wellington sat in his office, reviewing reports from various military installations where he had implemented his new approach to leadership development. The results were consistently positive: improved morale, better retention rates, higher performance scores, and most importantly, soldiers who felt valued as complete human beings rather than just military assets. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. His aide entered with a letter marked "Personal and Confidential." "Sir, this just arrived for you. It's from Second Lieutenant Mitchell." Wellington opened the letter carefully, curious about what the young officer wanted to share. "Dear General Wellington," the letter began, "I wanted to write to thank you not just for the opportunity you gave me, but for the lesson you taught me about true leadership. When you chose compassion over discipline that day at the palace gate, you changed not only my life but my understanding of what it means to serve others. My mother always told me that the most important thing in life was to treat people with kindness and respect, especially when they were struggling. I thought I understood what she meant, but I didn't really grasp it until I saw you put that principle into action when I needed it most. I've decided to dedicate my career to the same kind of leadership you showed me. Every soldier under my command will know that they are valued not just for what they can do, but for who they are as human beings. I believe this is what my mother would have wanted. And it's certainly what you taught me is possible. Thank you for seeing the person behind the uniform and for showing me that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. With deepest respect and gratitude, Second Lieutenant James Mitchell." Wellington set the letter down slowly, feeling a satisfaction deeper than any medal or commendation had ever provided. He had spent 30 years building a reputation based on rigid discipline and unwavering standards. But in one moment of human compassion, he had discovered a more powerful form of leadership, one that transformed both the leader and the lead. As he prepared to leave his office, Wellington caught sight of his reflection in the window. He looked the same as always, the same uniform, the same bearing, the same general's stars. But he knew that everything important had changed. He had learned that sometimes the most important order a leader could give was permission to be human. The young guard who had trembled at his post that morning had become an officer destined for great things. And the rigid general who had almost missed the opportunity to help him had become a leader who understood that true authority came not from commanding fear, but from inspiring hope. It had all started with a simple choice, whether to punish weakness or nurture strength. Wellington had chosen compassion, and that choice had transformed 2 lives in ways neither man could have imagined. Sometimes, he reflected, the most unexpected outcomes came from the most human responses to life's challenges.